Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Today is day 38 since Summer Wells went missing from the wooded hillside where her home is situated in Ben Hill Road, not far from Rogersville, Tennessee. 38 days later, law enforcement are saying they have no answers to where she is or why she disappeared. In this episode, we're going to examine two crucial tests for Candace and Don. In true crime, there's a toolbox that any self-respecting investigator knows to use. The timeline is one, identity is another, dynamics still another. And so we're going to go into two crucial tests we haven't looked at thus far. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the 49,900 of you who have subscribed. And let's get started. Now, bear in mind, I'll give some details at the end of this episode for another live stream I'm doing at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time later today. I'll tell you a little bit about what that's going to be about at the end of this episode. Now, in terms of this episode, in the Summer Wells case, there are clear and present problems and issues in all three of the areas I mentioned in terms of the timeline, identity, that's the identity of the people involved, and the dynamics. When I say identity, I'm talking about who someone is, their backstory, their patterns of behavior, and so on. So when a family are potentially implicated in the disappearance of a child, knowing the true family dynamics is absolutely key, but it's also extremely difficult to unravel. If it takes time to get to know one character, it takes so much more time to get to know a family group, and from there start to navigate our way through the intricacies of family dynamics. And grandma's silence ain't helping. In this episode, we're going to deal with two tools from the true crime toolbox that are often overlooked, yet vitally important. Once again, we want to look at each of these tools and see how they have a bearing on this case in isolation, but then also intertextually.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
So the first tool is urgency. In an emergency, especially a family emergency, we expect people, no matter what their personality or idiosyncrasy, no matter how rich or poor, educated or uneducated, we expect them to act with urgency. You might think urgency is a subjective standard, and it is. But one way to get around that is to use the classic legal axiom of the reasonable man. What would the reasonable man or reasonable person do in this situation? What would be reasonable? One of the first ports of call with any crime, but particularly a missing child, is the 911 call. How long did it take someone to call the authorities to report the emergency? We also want to know who called and what that call sounded like. That's an area still missing from this case, the audio of Candace's 911 call. So in lieu of that, we're going to look into another 911 call, a really famous call, and examine it for urgency.
How long ago was it?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's...
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says SBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Patsy Ramsey, I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
I'm sending an officer over, okay?
Please.
Do you know how long she's been gone?
No, I don't. Please, we just got out and she's right here. Oh my God, please.
Okay,
Please, there's somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath for
Please,
me, okay?
hurry.
Patsy.
So what do you think? Is there an appropriate level of urgency in that call from Patsy Ramsey? You might say yes, but then is it reasonable that she put the phone down on the operator? So she actually hung up on the 911 operator in the middle of her 911 call, basically. So on the one hand, you would say, yes, she did act with this sort of urgency we'd expect. The hurry, hurry, hurry part is what we'd expect from an innocent parent. But the Ramseys, and it's not just that Patsy didn't sort of speak at length to the operator. I mean, what else did she have to do when she put the phone down? What was she going to do? Make breakfast? What else was there to do except talk to the police, right? But you also can't look at that in isolation. It's not just the hanging up on the operator. It's the Ramseys not sitting down for a proper interview with the cops for 4 months, or taking a lie detector until mid-2000, 3 years after the fact. All of these point to issues of urgency, meaning the lack of urgency. So what you can also look at is the urgency of the 911 call in the Ramsey case, and then the lack of urgency following it, right? Does that make sense? Now, one thing we do know about the 911 call in terms of the Wells case is when it was made. It was made at 8:30 in the afternoon, early evening. It was made about an hour after Summer went missing and about 90 minutes before sunset on June 15, which was on that particular day 6 minutes past 8. If Summer did indeed go missing at 5:30, then calling the cops an hour later after a thorough search appears normal and reasonable. In other words, the requisite urgency appears on the face of it to be present. The only problem with this is what was said later. Both Candace and Don said they knew immediately that Summer was abducted. Well, if they knew immediately, then they ought to have called 911 immediately, say within 5 or 10 minutes, let's say at the most 15 to 20 minutes. So why have they waited twice that length of time? I mean, if they realized she was gone, why wouldn't they call as soon as they realized what had happened, right? So in this respect, the imputation of an abductor, there's a problem with urgency. If they were absolutely sure it was an abductor, why didn't they call sooner? Another perspective is that Summer may have been in some sort of trouble much earlier in the day at around 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock or even sooner. At least one witness, Alison Harris, the mother of Macbeth, thought something was wrong with Summer when Candace dropped Macbeth at home. Now, what is quite interesting is Macbeth didn't think anything was wrong with Summer, but his mother did, right? And that happened at around 2 o'clock or 2:30. So if something was wrong and Candace only called 911 4 hours later, right? So from 2:30, the time that you had this witness seeing that something appeared to be wrong, 4 hours go by, effectively. Well, if something was seriously wrong, then there is a serious problem with the lack of urgency. There is a lack of urgency and there's a serious problem. It's not a mere red flag sort of problem, so it's not just a little problem. It's a flag on the scale of Jupiter's great red spot. And like Jupiter's great red spot, the lack of urgency is a giant confusing maelstrom that is engineered to confound, and it has confounded. And you can take that whole idea of a giant confusing maelstrom engineered to confound and apply it to other cases as well, such as the John Benet Ramsey case. Did it confound? Well, it did. People are still confounded 25 years later. You can take that idea of the great red spot, a confusing maelstrom engineered to confound. Well, it has confounded people in that case, in the McCann case, 14 years later. There are other issues of urgency we can address, such as the length of time it took Don to address the media, as well as the length of time it took Candace to address the media. But in order to fully appreciate what we're talking about, we need to know exactly what those lengths of time were. And I call this post-meditation. I call, there's a certain degree of hand-holding in terms of psychology in the events that play out before an incident, during an incident, and after an incident. And I call the hand-holding after the incident post-meditation, the thinking that goes on afterwards, right? The motivations that take place afterwards hold hands with the motivations that take place before, and to some extent also during. Don first addressed the media on Friday, June 18th, right? 3 days after Summer disappeared. So there's not a lot of urgency there, is there? He doesn't address the media the same day or the next day or even the day after. It takes him 3 days, and it's sort of in response to what is happening in the media. And one's got to wonder, if the media didn't approach him or this wasn't in the media, would he have gone to the media? And you can ask the same thing about Chris Watts. Would Chris Watts have spoken to the media if the media didn't arrive on his porch? Would the sermon have happened if the cameras weren't there, kind of thing? So when Don first addressed the media on June 18th, how did that appear? Well, he was standing with his arm across his son's shoulder. And this is what Don said at the time. He said she was planting flowers with her mother and her grandmother, and she wanted to go into the house. So my wife watched her go into the house, and she went into the house. And the boys were on the internet, of course, and she wanted to go downstairs and play with her toys. So when her mother came in and she says, Summer, and she went down into the basement and she didn't answer. So she went down there and she was gone. So she went out the basement door, which was unlocked, and we haven't seen her since. Right? Now I'll put a link to that video in the description, and it's part of the timeline that I've dealt with before. You can listen to him give those various interviews chronologically. But the real issue is, what is missing from that statement? Remember, we're talking about urgency. What is missing from that statement? Well, it's the abductor. If they knew immediately that there was an abductor, why in this first statement, made 3 days afterwards, is there no mention of the abductor? In the Chris Watts case, the urgent thing missing from his story was that his wife was pregnant. That should have been the main thing, that she had a doctor's appointment. That urgency, that lack of urgency in terms of him disclosing information, is a serious problem. And in a similar way, we have the failure of both parents to really address the growing concerns about Summer going underwater. And I'm going to address them in some detail in the live coming up later this afternoon, right? So what's also interesting is that despite Don supposedly not being around that day, and that's something where there's also a bit of uncertainty. Where was Don that day? In spite of Candace being the last to see Summer, in spite of Candace being the last person to be with Summer, Don is the one telling the story on behalf of the family. This in itself is significant. Don goes on to say a prayer at a vigil in church, and I presume Candace is there, but Candace doesn't offer a prayer. When we see Candace at other prayer vigils, she's present, but she doesn't offer a prayer. On June 23rd, a Wednesday, Don again addressed the media to say that Candace had passed a lie detector test. So effectively, Don is nominating himself as the spokesman not only of the family, but he's also speaking on behalf of Candace. Don is in control. Don is controlling the narrative. Don is calling the shots. On June 25th, a Friday, which is day 10 since Summer disappeared, Candace Hara made a brief written statement. She basically said, "Bring my grandbaby home. She's a lovely baby, and we're so thankful for everyone looking for her. We yelled and looked for her as much as we could. She's just gone. It's devastating." So that word "just gone" is kind of an acknowledgement that it's sort of all over. They devastated, she's just gone, we looked for her, thank you everybody, the show's over, kind of thing. And since then, there's been nothing from the grandmother, certainly no statement on camera, like she did with her daughter, Rose. Now, what's also interesting in terms of this idea of urgency, is the release of photos of Summer. We already know that Robin helped the authorities get images of, whenever you have a child go missing, what the authorities need sort of first, the priority is to put out photos of this missing child. And so it's quite interesting that by this time, when Robin arrives at the property, I think around about 9 o'clock, the police still don't have photos of Summer, and so Robin's got to provide them. That's also showing a lack of urgency. Not only that, why weren't photos of Summer from the present released sooner? Meaning, the photos that are recognizably Summer at the swimming hole, in other words, with her short hair. In effect, why are the photos that appear on the billboards of kind of a different Summer, a Summer with long hair? What's going on there? Why were the authorities given older photos of Summer rather than up-to-date photos immediately? There's a similar situation to this in terms of the so-called last photos in the JonBenet Ramsey case. In my book, Christmas Star, the entire book deals with the fairly recently released new last photo of JonBenet Ramsey and what that means. But you have the same thing in the Madeleine McCann case. And it's just happened now in the Laurie Vallow case, where a new last photo has just emerged. A day after the search was scaled back, that was on Sunday, June 27th, which was day 13, Candace finally addressed the media. And guess what? With Don sitting at her side. It had taken her a full 2 weeks to actually make a statement in lieu of her missing youngest child, and when she did, she spoke in slow slurs through heavy, sleepy lids. Part of how one gauges urgency in a potential witness or suspect is by evaluating their effect. Does their appearance reflect urgency? Did one get a sense of urgency from Candace's appearance when she broke her silence? Did her emotions convey the importance of swift action, or the opposite? When she was asked about time, was she able to account for it or not? When she was asked about her own knowledge, insight about time, something that would be helpful to the authorities, she was unable to account for it, making kind of a weak excuse about, when you're having fun, you don't really know what's going on, right? In sum, urgency is about earnestness, insistence, persistence, determination, resolution, tenacity. But in true crime, the classic expression of urgency is time. In an emergency, you act quickly. So the critical question is, did Candace act quickly? Did Don act quickly? And I guess in an indirect way, you could also say, when Summer was under the water at the swimming hole, did Macbeth act quickly enough? And when they found her to be in whatever condition, what did they do then? Was there the required urgency that anyone else would have in that situation? In a crime which is also an emergency of a sort for the person who's at the center of it, it's just more of an emergency of self-preservation. That person's thinking about themselves, not the victim. Time is needed to cover up. In other words, what is being covered up is time. It's this preference for the needs of oneself over the unraveling of another that tends to be the undoing of the perpetrator, because they can't be in two places at once. And so how do they account for something they can't account for? In other words, they can't say what was really happening, what they were really spending their time doing. So they've got to create some kind of harmless alternative reality. And I suspect that a harmless reality in this story is, for example, the searching for flowers at the swimming hole and the planting of flowers at the home. Now let's go on to the next crucial test, and that is conviction. before we get to it, just think again about the first one, urgency. Do you think Don and Candace passed that test? Do you think they passed the urgency test, given what I've just said? You might want to play this video again, thinking about this idea of urgency and reviewing what I've just said. Now we go into conviction. Conviction's a funny thing. You can have too little conviction, but you can also have too much conviction. In the Chris Watts case, everyone noticed that Watts simply seemed to be too nonchalant about what had happened to his family. And when he was asked about that, he said, well, I'm hoping they're still coming back. But the problem was that he was too nonchalant. And what was that really going on was that nonchalance was he was trying to sort of soothe everyone into imagining that, well, maybe Shanann did just leave with the kids. But part of the nonchalance is also trying to pretend that he doesn't actually know what is going on. You know, he's not grief-stricken, he's not emotional, he's not worried. He's not overly worried because he doesn't actually know what is going on. He's innocent. But the other thing is, in a genuine situation like that, he ought to have been worried because his wife was pregnant and she missed a doctor's appointment. And by then, Tuesday, sort of midday, you know, she hadn't even come home the previous night. Well, then he ought to have been more worried. And why was he smiling and all that kind of thing? So that was what gave him away, his lack of conviction. But you can also be too sure too soon about something. In the Madeleine McCann case, when Kate McCann arrived at the apartment, she immediately knew Madeleine had been abducted. She didn't need to look for her, and she didn't look for her because she was so sure. And I'm going to put a link in the description to an article where the Portuguese police questioned exactly this. Why would she automatically assume Madeleine had been abducted? She didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. There was no scream. There were no footprints or fingerprints or anything. Even the other children who were there weren't awake. They weren't even awake. And there was no sign of forced entry. So why would the first thing be that you would think of an abduction? Why wouldn't you first think, well, maybe she wandered off, right? Now, being immediately devastated and immediately emotional when most people might still be wondering what had really happened also points to a surfeit of conviction. Remember, when a criminal has covered something up, they do have a conviction. They do have a knowledge, insight that they shouldn't have, that something has happened because they know something has happened. The cover-up is all about expressing a conviction about something they're pretending has happened with the hope that that pretense might catch on in the imaginations of others. In the Amanda Knox case, she becomes immediately convinced of a burglary in her home. That's conviction. But when she walks over a red footprint on the bathroom floor, and we all know what that was, she has a shower anyway. And what that shows is lack of urgency. In the Summer Wells case, we see the conviction that Summer was abducted, but no matching urgency. We see absolute conviction that something has happened to Summer, but no appropriate emotion. Candace has appeared at 3 prayer vigils now and not offered up a prayer or a tear herself, ditto Grandma. Although Candace and Don are both convinced Summer was abducted, neither expressed that conviction early on, with urgency as one might expect. Was an abductor even mentioned in the 911 call? Interestingly, we do get a sense of conviction and urgency from Alison Harris when she talks about seeing Summer in the back seat of the truck, apparently asleep. Alison felt concern and wanted to reach out and touch her. The interplay between conviction and urgency can be complicated, but a true crime rocket scientist tends to know when that interplay is off. In the video of little Summer on the back seat, when Candace talks about wanting to capture footage of the little girl who sort of slumped over, she wanted to have her arm up. There's no sign of concern in her voice or face. There's no urgency either. Instead, there's a sense of disappointment and also resignation. In Don's statement where he says Summer's outdoorsiness was her downfall, there's also a sense of resignation. There seems to be a suggestion here that Summer was somehow responsible for her own demise. But how could Don know that unless someone else who knew told him? And how does Don respond? Does he blame anyone? Is he pursuing the abductor? Or is there this lingering sense of resignation about what has happened? I've mentioned that word a number of times, resignation. It means to be stoic, to accept something that is undesirable but inevitable, like an investigation and or reporters asking questions. It means patient forbearance, tolerance and fortitude, but in effect, resignation is the opposite of urgency or conviction. Do you see that? Instead of doing and saying, resignation focuses on not doing and not saying. And don't we get a sense of that also from Grandma? In other words, when we apply these two crucial tests to Candace and Don, urgency and conviction, do you think they pass? So I hope you found this examination from the True Crime Toolbox useful and handy. It's something you can use in all true crime cases, not just this one, and the intertextual element is really quite fascinating. And I hope what I've said makes sense to you. Does it? Does that make sense? So in this afternoon's live, which will be at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I'll be going through some of the notes that I've taken from Macbeth's interview. I think we were all expecting there to be part 2 yesterday, and there wasn't. So I felt a bit disappointed with that, also a little bit misled by that. But I'm going to take you through the notes that I took from the original interview and some other observations that I've made that I think take the narrative forward. You heard the creator in that not wanting to be drawn into certain questions. I'm going to provide some of my opinions on what I think really happened. I'm also going to put my hand up and say I'm a little bit critical of the investigation in one area, right? And you might say, well, you've got no place to say that. But I think given that some is still missing and that, the leader of the search has no answers, I think we need to come up with ideas, don't you, in the search for Summer Wells. So I'm going to provide an idea, basically a suggestion, which I've actually mentioned earlier, but I'm going to provide it again, and it'll be interesting to see what you guys think. So I hope to see many of you guys in chat. I'll also be taking some of your questions and reading some of your comments. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.